You have to be so careful who your kids hang out with. Can I have your attention? That's what we're going to be speaking about today. You know, in our setup, in our country, specifically in this city, you don't really have to worry that much about your neighbors because you never see your neighbors. You have this big, massive wall and electrified fence and you never see your neighbors. So you don't really have to worry about that. But the principles we're going to learn about in terms of how we know how to choose who our kids should interact with will actually be from the laws or the insight that the Torah has about neighbors. So that's where we're going to start, right? Pick your neighbors carefully. So for example, let's just make this relatable. For example, if you live in certain countries in the Middle East, you want to make sure that your neighbor is not somebody that the United States is planning to take out in an airstrike, because could be a bit too close for comfort, right? That kind of concept. So how does that translate into our reality? Make sure that your neighbor is not some kind of a drug runner or something like that. So when the police come, they don't arrive in your house, or you get, So you got to choose your neighbors really carefully. And it's a similar kind of concept with our kids, because I think sometimes we don't realize to what extent children are susceptible to those who are around them, in exactly the same ways we don't necessarily realize how susceptible we are to those around us. And there are a number of different ways that we could test this, that we could see this in our own lives. I don't want to get into things that might be uncomfortable, like, for example, the particular peptides that you might be using because of your neighbor. Not talking about that kind of thing, but it tells a story, right? That we are creatures of herd mentality. It's really interesting, but we really are. As much as we claim individuality and as much as we believe that we can express ourselves in a unique way, either in how we dress or what kind of things we read, or various ways that we try and create this individuality for ourselves, at the end of the day, we are creatures that are gregarious and we are susceptible to influence in I suppose, the same ways we influence other people too, but we are susceptible to influence consistently. And the same thing is true of our children. So we have to be really, really careful in terms of cultivating a healthy peer group so that the influences that our children have are positive influences. Just in case you thought we were going down the tech route, we're not. This is not a conversation about social media and that kind of exposure. It's an important conversation we should have, not today's conversation. But today we're talking about actual humans. The actual humans that your kids engage with and what kind of difference it could make in their lives. And I'm sure we've all got experience with this. There's a little bit, sometimes you hope it's the children's experience, right? Or influence. In other words, when a kid comes home and uses language that you don't approve of, you hope that they didn't hear that at home. You'd like to be able to blame, I don't know which kids you've been hanging out with. So sometimes I guess there's comfort in knowing that there is peer influence. And we also have to recognize we don't get to control these things completely. So you can't immunize your children against influence, especially in our community where we all tend to go to the same schools, go to the same shuls, hang out in the same places for our weekly entertainment, attend the same extracurricular activities. So we are kind of a fishbowl, our community. And so, there's a limit to how much you can orchestrate the influence of your children because there isn't the same large pool that there might be in other places in the world. That is not a reason for us to be complacent. And it is not a justification for us not to play a proactive role in choreographing the right kind of influence around our children. Today's conversation is not about adult influence. Another conversation. Today we're talking specifically about peer influence. What kind of kids, which child am I happy for my child to be friendly with? Now, we can get into a whole debate over here as to how much power and influence you're entitled to wield over those decisions, and at what ages and stages you can say, I don't want you being friends with so-and-so, and whether you should even say it that way. I don't want you to be friends with her. That's another whole conversation. But right now, the first thing we need to do Let's just understand the principle. How porous are our boundaries to those who are around us? In other words, how susceptible are we to influence? Let's start there, and from that, we'll move our way forward. So, there's an expression that our sages use. It's a very disturbing expression. The expression starts with the word oi, so you already know where we're going. You ever hear that story of the 4 Jewish women who go out to play cards? And before they even deal the cards, the first woman says, oi. And then the second one says, oi vey. And then the third one says, oi vey is mir. So the last one says, okay, enough about the children, let's play cards. This expression that our sages use starts with the word oi. So you know that whatever's coming, not going to be a positive story. So the expression goes like this. Oi le rasha. I don't have to translate what oi means, right? Oi for a person who is not a good person. A rasha, bad person. Oi, shame. It's unfortunate, it's terrible that they're a bad person. Now, pause. I want to pause before we finish the sentence. Do we ever say that? Do we ever feel that way? Oi, look at so-and-so. They have no discipline. Their children have no discipline. Oi. Right, we do that, right? We have our assessment, our judgment, our criticism of the person who, in our perspective, is not really handling things in the way that they should. Oi, did you hear about so-and-so? They ripped off their business, and now the cops are on their tail and they had to skip the country. Oi. Right? Oi, did you hear about so-and-so? The marriage fell to pieces because they were having an affair. Oi. Right? Etc., etc. So we understand that the word oi, there's different kinds of oi. There's the kind of oi when you drop what you were holding and it splatters on the floor. Oi. And then there's the kind of oi when there's a scandal. Oi. So oi le rasha, when our sages say oi about the bad person, that's the scandalous oi. Oh my gosh. What a horrible story. So far we're all on board, right? We relate to that. We get that. We appreciate that. Sometimes with the greatest degree of compassion dripping on the words that we use. When we say oi, we're really saying, did you hear? Mm-hmm. Did you hear? In South Africa, we have a different way of doing this. We say shame. Which essentially means we don't feel any pity for this person, but shame. It's such a terrible story, right? So oi is like that. It's like the Jewish version, right? Oi! Did you hear the scandal? So far, so good. Something we can relate to. When I mean so good, I mean, like we get it. We understand what the sages are saying. It makes sense to us. So that kid who became a delinquent, oi. Usually followed by, I always saw it coming. I knew that kid, you know. And then the next layer is their parents should have. You know, we've got our whole assessment of how the whole thing works. It's the easiest thing, unfortunately, to sit in our comfortable space oiing about somebody else. It's the next part of the phrase that the sages use that really is the part that hits home. Oi le rasha, oi to the person who's not a good person, oi lishchenoi, oi to their neighbor. In other words, if you're in proximity to the person who's not doing so well, it's not good for you either. So it's not okay just to say, oh, shame, did you hear what happened? It's so terrible, it's unfortunate, and kind of leave it at that as if to say, we're okay. Because I think that's part of the psychology of what human beings like to do. We always need to reassure ourselves. You ever notice this about human psychology? If something bad happens, we need to reassure ourselves. So for example, God forbid there's a terrible accident in the community. We do weird things without even thinking about it. Weird things like, oh, but. So somebody, God forbid, died in a terrible accident. We say, oh, but it was a drunk driver. Almost as if to say, I just need to protect myself. I need my world still to be okay. So if I know that there was a freak accident, then I'm still safe on the roads. That kind of thinking. So when we say, oi, did you hear what happened to so-and-so? The kid got kicked out of school. The kid became an addict, God forbid. Or whatever the case is. We say, oi, and then we immediately want to put in the but, which is to create a barrier between ourselves and that particular event, as if to say, happens to other people. This is the kind of thing that happens to other people. Our sages come along and say, that's not how it works. Oy le rasha. If something is bad, if something negative is happening in somebody else's life, oy le shcheno, it's bad for me if I'm in the proximity, if I'm the neighbor, if I'm the peer group, then I'm the one who has to be concerned. Don't sit there immunizing yourself and saying, well, at least it wasn't. And we've all got, it's a fascinating psychology, we've all got the at least it wasn't. So you know why that kid landed up? Because there was dysfunction in that family. You know why that kid that? Because those parents were too overbearing. And every one of us is convinced, to a greater or lesser extent, we're convinced that we are actually pretty decent. None of us believes that we're excellent parents, but we're pretty decent. I actually heard a great line yesterday where somebody said, what's her name? Lisa Glossman, I think her name is. She's a big parenting expert in the States. So I think it was her who said that I am an exceptional parent some of the time. It's a good way to look at it, but we don't. We often look at ourselves as one kind of standard. Of course, we have our moments where we feel, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing over here, and I think I'm destroying my child. But generally speaking, we think we're better than the average, generally speaking, right? So when we hear those stories that something went awry, we say, well, at least it's not me. We want to immunize ourselves. The sages come along and say, that's not how it works. Oy le rasha. If something negative is happening in the environment, oy le shcheno. If I'm in the environment, I need to be a little bit concerned. How close to home is this? When something negative occurs, it is negative for the neighbors too. If something negative happens in my child's peer group, then it's close to home. The Talmud uses a different expression in a different context, but it illustrates the same point, that if in a social circle, God forbid, somebody passes away, the entire social circle should be introspective. It's not just that somebody passed away and that is sad or even tragic. So something happened in our environment. There was a fissure in the wall of safety in our environment. So we've all got to be introspective. Oy le rasha. If something negative is happening in the peer group, oy le shcheno. If I'm in the proximity, I need to be vigilant. I've got to be aware. So the first thing I have to be aware of is to know if not such good stuff is happening in the environment. Got to have a finger on the pulse. What's actually happening in my child's world? What's actually happening in their classroom, in their peer group, in the playground, in the shul garden? I just need to know what's happening. So that's the first thing. We need to have some kind of feedback mechanism where our children are giving us insight into what's going on. And sometimes we get that feedback mechanism directly from the children. Sometimes we have to just keep an eye open and an ear to the ground just to hear what's going on around. Some people are better at this than other people. Personally, I'm not good at it. But there are people who are really good at that. They know how to keep an ear to the ground. They know how to know what's going on. Somehow, like I'm one of those people, I get to hear like 6 months after the event happened. Did you not hear about it? No, I didn't. But sometimes then what you need to do is surround yourself by good sources of information. Somebody who's a little bit more willing to share or a little bit more in the group. We have to know what's going on with our children, because if oy le rasha, if something unhealthy is happening in the environment, inevitably oy le shcheno, it is potentially going to affect our kids. So we need to know. And as a result, we also need to know how to deploy our kids or move our kids or protect our kids. Maybe you shouldn't be spending so much time with this particular individual or with that. You just got to work out, how do we ensure that they're not exposed to the things that are really unhealthy. So now, where did the sages get this idea from? That oy le rasha. If you've got a bad person in the hood, then it's bad for everybody. Where did they get that from? Let's think, if you could identify in the Torah, meaning to say in the 5 books of the Chumash, I'll give you a clue. It's not this week's parasha, because I know that's where everybody's going to go. It's hinted at in this week's parasha, but the story is not in this week's parasha. But where do you know a story of people who got into trouble? I'll give you a clue. It was in the desert, in the 40 years in the desert, so we've narrowed down 3,500 years of Jewish history to 40 years, where people got into trouble because of their neighbors in the desert. No. Golden calf is a good guess. It is a good guess, but we don't see in that story specifically the bad influence of neighbors. I'm looking specifically for neighbors because that's where the sages find the story. And the reason it's important for us is because when we find the correct story, it will help us get the right context. So agreed, the golden calf was bad influence of having the wrong people in the environment. So it's a very good insight. It's not the one we're going to focus on today. Anybody else know of a story of neighbors? Okay, let's try something different. Out of all of the characters that you read about in the 40 years of the desert, who as an individual stands out as a troublemaker? The golden calf was a group, was a pocket of people that agitated around the golden calf. By the way, the golden calf did not land up involving the whole population, even though the whole population was considered, in a sense, accessory to the golden calf. But they didn't all worship the golden calf. That's a misconception. I'm collecting a list of misconceptions. We call it every Jewish person. Which brothers?
The brothers, the one brother that, but he's like the next soul of it.
So who you're thinking of? Or what's the story, even if you don't remember the names?
The two brothers that fight, and then the one brother killed the other brother.
Oh, that's much earlier on, before the 40 years in the desert.
His soul.
Oh, you're saying the reincarnation of Cain and Abel. That's very interesting. Very much on track. Very much on track. That's like higher grade. That's higher grade. You get to move 2 seats forward now. So that's very impressive. That's really impressive. So let's just put that into context. So I'll come back to it in a second. I was just saying I'm collecting this thing of misconceptions, stories that people have in the Torah that they don't know how the story really happened. Golden calf is one of them. It wasn't this across the board, everybody served the golden calf. It's much more nuanced than that. Just putting that out there, together with eating the apple. Right? It's the same kind of thing. Okay, so that's a brilliant insight. We know the story of Cain and Abel, right? Cain kills his brother Abel. And one of the versions of, because souls are very complex, so it's not just like person A becomes person B, but one of the variations, one of the mutations of their souls comes back as these two individuals who are at loggerheads. One is called Moshe, okay? Who's the person who went up against Moshe? Was a man called Korach. Okay? So Korach is the person we're looking for. Why are we looking for Korach? Because Korach had neighbors. Obviously his own tribe, his own family, his clan, who became his biggest supporters. But if you know how the Jews camped in the desert, there was a very specific format. You had the Mishkan, the sanctuary, in the middle. You then had the Kohanim and the Levim around the Mishkan. And then you had 3 tribes on each side of the camp. And each of the 3 tribes had a single banner. And therefore there was one head of the 3 tribes who carried that banner. So Korach lives on the southern side of the Mishkan. And the 3 tribes that lived on the southern side of the encampment were the tribes of Reuven, Shimon, and Gad. Reuven is the direct neighbor. Their tribe is the direct neighbor to the clan that Korach belonged to. And so what happens is, when Korach starts his rebellion against Moshe, which is a fascinating story in its own right, that he had issues with the leadership and he felt that everybody should be a leader and all kinds of interesting things. When he started his rebellion against Moshe, he needed people to support him. So who landed up becoming his biggest support base? The tribe of Reuven. And they got on board and they were involved in the rebellion, and therefore, as a result, when Korach gets punished, does anybody remember how Korach got punished? Because it's quite remarkable. It's a very unusual story. Anybody remember? No? So it's an earthquake, but an unusual earthquake where the earth literally opens, they all get sucked in, and then it closes. So earthquakes don't normally resolve afterwards. They don't like patch up afterwards. There's usually a crack in the ground. That's how it is. And in this particular case, the way that the Talmud understands it, they don't just get sucked into the earth, but they got sucked into some kind of a black hole within the earth. They're in this perpetual state of falling. I don't know what that looks like. It's like some kind of anti-gravity kind of experience where you're stuck in this abyss and you can't get out. So who lands up dying? Korach and his clan. Not just his biological family members, but the people who got on board with his rebellion. So they got caught up as well. Say the sages, you see? Oy le Rasha. Oy vey. Did you hear what happened to Korach? Terrible story. Guy went off the rails. He was such a decent person. He was, what do they always say in these, when they interview people after like the serial killer or whatever, because we would never have seen it coming. He was such a nice guy. He was always friendly to our dogs. That kind of thing. The next thing, Korach, scandal. This is the person who's led a rebellion against Moshe. It's a terrible story. He gets swallowed up. It's horrible. Oy lerasha. It's a terrible story about the bad guy. Oy lishchenoi. It's a terrible story about his neighbors because his neighbors got caught in the crossfire. So that's the origin of this principle that you've got to make sure you hang out with the right people, because if you don't hang out with the right people, bad things can happen. I just want to balance that, because the same sages who say this also say that, and there's two variations of how to say this. One variation is toiv latzadik. What does toiv mean? Good. Good, latzadik, for a righteous person. It's good for a righteous person. Very often people are going to start sentences with, did you hear about so-and-so? That's okay. I'm not endorsing, I'm not saying we should sit there talking about people, but that's what happens. If people are going to speak about you, you would like the next part of the sentence to be how amazing they are. If people are already going to say, did you hear about so-and-so? At least they should then continue with a positive message, right? You don't ever want to be that person, did you hear about oy vey? So toiv latzadik. When you speak about a righteous person, it's good. People are going to say, good, did you hear about so-and-so? Amazing. What a wonderful person. What a mensch. So toiv latzadik. If it's good, if the things that happen for the righteous person are good things, toiv lishchenoi. It will also be good for the people in their environment, in their peer group. So it works both ways. If you hang out with people who are not such great people, don't expect great things to happen. If you hang out with people who are great people, you can imagine that great things will happen. That's essentially what it's saying. Like I said, the two variations. There's another version of it that says not toiv latzadik, but ashrei latzadik. Ashrei is an ambiguous word. It's deliberately designed to have two meanings. Ashrei could mean happy, and ashrei could mean praised. So you're happy and praiseworthy if you're a good person, and then you're happy and praiseworthy if you hang out in the vicinity of good people. Either way, the message is the same. Hang out with a good crowd, it will be good for you. God forbid, hang out with not such a good crowd, it's not going to be so good for you. So far, have we learned anything that is mind-blowing and unexpected? I don't think so. I think we all pretty much know that the people you hang out with are going to have a profound effect on you, So you don't want, as any good parent, or possibly in many cases grandparent, will say, I don't like that crowd. Right? We know this. You don't need the sages of the Talmud for that.
It also applies to us. We're talking about children, and we often see it as our kids, but it also applies to us.
For sure.
And ours also applies to our children.
For sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. For the purpose of our conversation, we focus on our children. Why? Because it's much more likely that we'll take the steps necessary to protect our children than to take the steps necessary to protect ourselves. So hopefully we can learn from what we do for our children to apply it to ourselves too. It's always much more compelling, right? Imagine you tell people about using devices and social media, whatever, because how bad it is for the kids. We'll listen. How bad it is for you? What else am I supposed to do at night? Helps me relax. The biggest lie of the modern world. I need to scroll at night because it helps me relax. Anyhow, subject for another conversation. Let's come back. So if you really want to understand what our sages are telling us, you have to, as we often do in Judaism, you have to get much more specific. Generic lines are the easiest things to produce in our world. People are shooting out generic things all the time, especially thanks to AI. You can generify anything. Judaism is anything but generic. And I think the more we understand this, the better we understand this, the more value we'll have in our lives. Don't turn Judaism into bumper stickers or fridge magnets or throwaway lines. The world is full of those. We don't need the wealth and the depth of Judaism to give us more throwaway lines. Oi, the tzaddik, oi, the Rasha, oi, the neighbor. Before you know it, can you imagine, like your neighborhood watch is going to have this on their cars. Oi, the Rasha, oi, the neighbor. So we've got to get into the nuance, because the nuance will give us a much deeper understanding of what this means and how to apply it in our lives. And to do that, we're going to look at 3 different opinions as to how the story with Korach and his neighbors played out. This is so Jewish. Can you imagine? Anybody else, I don't have the patience or the insight to start working out 3 different variations on what happened. To me, it's clear. This was a bad guy, and that was a person who got dragged in. Simple. But the sages say that's not always how it works. So let's explore the 3 different opinions. Opinion number 1 comes from a source that is called the Midrash Tanchuma. Midrash is a commentary on the Torah. The purpose of Midrash is to give us insight into what the Torah is telling us without getting into all the halachic perspective, just what the message is, what the lessons are, and some of the history and story that isn't necessarily reflected in the words itself. But the Midrash is written at the same time in history as the Mishnah, in other words, the early Talmudic period, in other words, 2,000 years ago. We're going to look today at 2 different Midrashic sources. One is called Rabbi Tanchuma's Midrash, and one is called the Midrash Rabbah. Then we're going to look at the opinion of Rashi. Rashi lived quite a lot later. Rashi is almost 1,000 years after that. Okay? But a very important perspective. So the Midrash, the first Midrash we'll look at, Rabbi Tanchuma says this. Oy le Rasha. That's Korach, bad guy. Oy le Shchenoi. Oy vei. Look what happened to the neighbors. The neighbors also were punished because they were in proximity to Korach. So that's the first perspective. The first perspective is you hang out with the wrong people, it could land up coming at a cost. Not that the cost is to who you are, the cost is to what happens to you. So that's the example of the guy who's bin Laden's neighbor, not a good place to live. Right? If they're calling in a airstrike, you don't want to be there. Okay, that's the simplest. Oile Russia, Oile Shcheno, give you an example, contemporary example. I had a neighbor recently who was running an illegal business out of their house. So Oile Shcheno was bad for me. Why? Because the whole day I heard this machinery going. You know, there was grinding and drilling and whatever the case. For a day, eventually we had to call in the authorities. It was ridiculous. But as long as it was going on, Oile Russia, they were breaking the law. Oile Shcheno, I was suffering. That's the fact. I didn't become a bad person because I didn't say, you know what, if they could, I'm going to, you know. But it just affected me. So that's the first level. The first awareness you have to have is that if something negative is happening in the peer group, who knows, they might get collective punishment. Your child might be that kid who comes up and says, it's not fair. We all had to stay in during break today, and I did nothing. That's basically the first version. Oile Russia. Sometimes, just unfortunate. You hang out with the bad guys, bad things happen. And the corollary of that would be, Toiv la tzadik, toiv l'shchenoi. If you hang out with a good crowd, if you happen to have a goody-goody class, so 2 or 3 kids did something really well, the whole class is getting cake. Same principle, right? I have a good neighbor. If anybody who lives in this neighborhood, I won't say name because we're recording things over here. Anybody who's on the Sandown WhatsApp group, so you'll know that there's certain people saving the river and fencing in security things or whatever. You live in a good neighborhood, you have good people, you benefit. They get the potholes fixed, they get the street lights done. Right? True? So that's the simple basic level. If you hang out in a good environment, you will benefit. If you have a not such a good environment, you're going to suffer. Then you have the Midrash Rabbah. Same time frame, same sages. Midrash Rabbah has a very different perspective on this. The Midrash Rabbah says, Oy LaRasha, a terrible thing happened to this man called Korach that because of his rebellion against Moshe got wiped out. Oy LeShchenoi, but you know who else got wiped out? People who themselves were conflict-oriented people. In other words, the Midrash Rabbah says that the exact opposite way around. The Midrash Rabbah says, you know why these people became his neighbors? Because birds of a feather flock together. Because he was that guy who every time you spoke to him, he had something. Did you hear about so-and-so? Do you think the leadership knows what they're doing? This school is finished. I'm telling you. 5 years, and it's done. I don't know where they chose this principle from. What were they thinking? They messed up the previous school that we had, and now we're the ones that have to get the short end of the stick. So who's going to gravitate to that kind of person? The people who also have a whole chip on their shoulder. So they land up hanging together. And when people who are in a negative headspace all hang out together, that's going to compound the negativity until eventually something bad happens. So the Midrash Rabbah says it's not just because you happen to be the neighbor and he brings bad stuff into the neighborhood, so your water is also going to be polluted. It means if you're still hanging around with such a bad neighbor, it's a bit of an indictment on you. Why are you still there? If this is a guy who's causing so much trouble, why are you still hanging out? Why do you still have this person at your Shabbos table? Why do you still go for coffee with him? So that's a completely different perspective, which effectively says we have to take responsibility. Things don't happen just so. They happen with intention. And if we land up in a situation, likely it's because we, to a certain extent, allowed that situation. That's not that we should victim blame people here, but we have to just be conscious. So we have to then test, are our children gravitating to certain groups because we're allowing that to happen, because we're kind of creating, there's something about that vibe that we're partial to, so we're allowing that vibe to happen. Equally, you know why you get the benefit of living with good people? Because that tells you that you care about good things. That's why you've chosen to live with good people. This is much less about your geographical neighbors as it is about the friend groups that you create around you. So if we allow ourselves to hang out with people who are so negative, who always see the dark side of the coin, who are always complaining, who are always taking risks, then we shouldn't expect that we are fundamentally different from them. If we were fundamentally different, we wouldn't feel comfortable in that environment. So the Midrash Rabbah is on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is take a long, hard look in the mirror. How did we land up here? Okay, so again, the first Midrash is saying, you're not a bad person. You're just in the danger zone if you hang out with bad people. You're in the benefit zone if you hang out with good people. The other Midrash is saying almost the exact opposite. If you find that the people around you are not healthy people, ask yourself, how did you get here? And if you find that the people around you are wholesome people, then you can take some pride in the fact that you got yourself here. Then comes Rashi's perspective. Rashi says, again, this is not a disagreement with the others. Rashi is giving us another perspective. Rashi's perspective is, and this is the one that's the most insightful for us bringing up our children. Rashi says you have to realize people are gregarious. People reflect what is happening around them. Now, I saw a fascinating thing. I'd never encountered this before, but it's absolutely fascinating. We all know that non-verbal communication is extremely powerful, right? So whether we're conscious, whether we're trained in non-verbal communication or not, the fact is we pick up all kinds of cues, non-verbal cues from people all the time. I saw this absolutely fascinating thing where there was a murder case and they had a suspect. And they were trying to work out, they didn't have enough evidence to pin on the subject. So they were trying, through the interrogation, they were trying to work out if this person was potentially the perpetrator. So one of the things that the detective did in the interview was a few times during the interview, yawned. Now we all know from our own experience that yawning is to a certain extent contagious. It's like a social contagion. It's a subtle messaging from people that you actually respond when people around you yawn. You find, without even realizing, you find yourself yawning. And this person didn't respond. So obviously you can't take that in isolation, but they said that together with other clues that they got, non-verbal clues, indicated a level of sociopathy. Because a sociopath is not sensitive to what other people are feeling and experiencing. So normal people, if the people around you start to yawn, you'll also feel it, consciously or subconsciously. somebody who's unable to feel what other people are going through doesn't respond in the normal way. And that became actually a pivotal moment, at least in the detective's assessment of what was going on, to go down a particular route and then eventually expose this person as the perpetrator, which is fascinating, right? It's a fascinating thing. What does that tell you? Any person who believes that they are not susceptible to the influence around them is totally out of touch. It's not possible. We're designed in the same way as our skin is porous, our personality is porous. Whatever's going on around us is going to seep in. So Rashi says, Oy l'Rasha, if things are bad for the bad person in the group, Oy l'Ishcheno, it will rub off on the people in the group, and they will start to absorb some of that cynicism, that risk-taking, that chutzpah, that laziness, whatever the negative energy is, you have to expect that it's going to get through the defenses, especially children who are very susceptible to influence. It's going to get into their world. And so if you take Rashi's perspective, that's kind of the most stark message to a parent. You want to believe that your child is resilient. You want to believe that you've created enough of a fortress of values around your child. You have to realize we're all human, and humans are interactive beings. We draw from each other. By the way, the Rambam says a similar thing, not in the interpretation of this line, Oy l'Rasha, but he says it in a different context about just generally where a person should choose to live. And he says a person should always choose to live in an environment of good people, people who have good values and people who are compassionate. And if the environment you find yourself in does not have those kinds of people, he says you have to move to a different neighborhood or a different town if need be. And he goes so far as to say this: if you cannot find a wholesome environment, rather move out of the urban life and become a hermit. Because it's better, he says, for a person to be in their own space than to be in a social environment that is counterproductive. So that's a similar thing, essentially, that Rashi tells us. And that's why you'll find something interesting, that when Rashi comments on this influence between Korach and his neighbors, Rashi says, for example, they're the two people, Dasan and Aviram, these two people who were like big troublemakers at the, throughout, even before Korach came onto the scene. And they obviously were his henchmen because they were bad people. So Rashi says there was Korach, Dasan, and Aviram, and 250, he makes this specific point, 250 other leaders who got dragged in. The reason he does it is he wants you to understand that those 250 ordinary citizens, people that others respected, they became as bad as Dasan and Aviram, who were troublemakers from day one. Why? Because they hung out with people who were into the wrong things. And that's where the take-home message is for us. The first thing about fixing a problem is acknowledging the problem. There's an expression in Hebrew that we use that we say, Yedi'as ha'machala, knowing the disease, chatzi refuah, is half the cure. Any person, God forbid, who's ever had to deal with a medical issue that they cannot get a medical diagnosis for, will know how painful it is to try and deal with something that is unknown, and will know the paradoxical feeling of getting that diagnosis that is shattering on the one hand and yet gives you clarity, so you feel, now I can do something, now I can move forward. Knowing what the problem is, where the problem lies, where the challenge is halfway to a better outcome. In plain English, believing that because I have good values at home, and I have an open communication with my children, and I don't allow just any kind of behavior, believing that that alone is going to ensure that they can withstand the peer pressure of life, is a terrible error. Recognizing that peer influence is potentially the greatest influence in our children's lives, especially in the teen years, then at least we know what we're dealing with. We can start to take some kind of steps to remedy it. So that's the first thing we have to acknowledge as parents. The circle my children hang out with. I'm not talking about the people who sit next to them in the class, because that may not be a social circle. It depends how large the class is. Even in a smaller class, there will still be circles, cliques within the class. But the people my kids hang out with, those people may have a more profound impact on their attitudes, their values, than I do. Not because I'm a bad parent, not because I'm not invested, because that is the nature of humans. We are susceptible to our peer group. If we're honest, we'll identify it in our own lives, and if we're conscious, we'll identify it in our children's lives. Well, that really means something very simple. Now let's put all three perspectives together, because they're all true, obviously, they're just different perspectives. So you have Rashi's perspective, which says we are always susceptible to the influence of peers. Again, I'm emphasizing peers because people who are going through similar life experiences to us at whatever age and stage of life we're at, those are the people who actually have the most profound influence over us. Even if we have a guru or a mentor or a rabbi or a therapist, the reality is they're swimming upstream against all of this influence that's happening around us from those people who look like us, sound like us, behave like us, face similar experiences to us. And if that's true for us, it's certainly true of children, because children do not yet have the maturity, they don't have that evolved prefrontal cortex to actually work it out for themselves. So they're way more susceptible, which means I have responsibility to them. That's Rashi's perspective.
What age does that come?
What, the prefrontal cortex? Your early 20s. So early to mid, like that's when it starts to really consolidate. Different conversation for a different time. That means most of the really critical life decisions that people make, they do in an immature state, right? People they date, what career path they're going to take, subject for another conversation. So the first thing I have to be aware of is Rashi's perspective. It's real. That influence is real. I have to know that. Secondly, I have to realize it is real and more compelling than my influence. I have to know that. That's not because I'm a bad parent. That's not because I'm not doing my best. That's not because I cannot have a profound impact on my child. All of that is true. But that peer influence is compelling, and at certain phases in their life, the most compelling part of their life. Then you have the perspective of the Midrash Rabbah. The Midrash Rabbah says, we land up with neighbors because we've chosen to have those neighbors. That is really important information for us, because that tells us we have agency. We're not stuck. It's not just this randomized experience of life and who happens to be in your group and then you're just stuck with them. As we often say, right? I had a particularly good year. My class, they were a good year at school. So I had a particularly bad year at school. We say things like that, and they are true. They're valid. And sometimes parents have to be courageous enough to say, therefore, my child's moving. Because if that's the environment, and it's not enhancing my child, it's not adding value to it, my child may have to move. And everybody around says, how could you take your child? It's not your child, not your business, not your responsibility. I have to speak one day to my 40-year-old child and say, you know why we did X? Rather than saying, you know why we didn't, or I'm sorry we didn't do X. So the second lesson, the Midrash Rabbah is telling us, recognize that it is our choice. We may have limited choices. That's not a bad thing. If we had too many choices, life would be overly confusing. So there are limited choices, which is great. Then I know this is not healthy. Therefore, my choices are X and Y, which is usually how it is in our environment, right? If this isn't working, I pretty much have 2, maybe 3 other choices of how we could do things. That's great. That helps me because I've got a framework within which I can work. If it was too open-ended, I wouldn't know what to do. Sometimes it's not as radical as I have to take my kid out of the school and put them in that school because their class is bad. Sometimes it's just very simply to say, within this, there are dynamics within this class. I need to ease my child out of that particular social dynamic. It's not good for them. And we have agency, especially in this country. Your child's not hopping onto a public transportation to get to their friends. You're taking them. You say, I'm sorry, but I'm not happy to take you to that event, to that party, to that child, right? We have that. And not just authoritarian, to say to them, I'm concerned, Perhaps you don't appreciate it right now. It is my responsibility. I know that we're susceptible to influence. Therefore, I want you to be in a wholesome environment. I want you to be in the Tov Latzadik environment, not in the Oy Larasha environment. So that's the second part of the perspective, to realize that we have capacity, that we can actually make a difference. And then the third is, if we think it's okay, don't worry, it will iron itself out, then you've got to remind yourself of the third perspective, the Midrash Tanchuma, which is people who hang out in unsafe environments, God forbid, land up having unsafe experiences. People who hang out in healthy environments, please God, land up having filling and fulfilling experiences. So I can't just simply say, life will take its course and everything will be fine. I'm sure it will work out. We have to be pragmatic enough to realize choices have consequences. Groups have consequences. If my child is in a healthy place, they will benefit. Fact. If they're not in a healthy place, I shouldn't be surprised if something that untoward, God forbid, happens. So you put those three perspectives together, and you have the beginning of a template of what we should be doing with our kids. Recognize that they're susceptible. Just be honest about that. They are susceptible. It's a fact. Be proactive, because that's our responsibility, to guide them into the right kind of peer group that will be best for them, which means two kids, not necessarily the same formula. Probably not the same formula. And as a little bit of incentive, it's just the realization that this decision will have outcomes. There will be consequences. Hopefully I'll choose right, and those consequences will be highly positive and enriching. God forbid I don't. I can't just say, wow, I wonder what happened. I have to realize, I have a responsibility, I have an opportunity, and I have a role to play. So the goal over here of this conversation is not to overwhelm us, not to make us think, oy vey, on top of everything, now I have something else to worry about. It's to sensitize us, to realize that we really have an opportunity. And it doesn't matter what age your child is, because at any time that they're still living under our roof, we still have that opportunity. Even after they spread their wings, we still have a far more limited opportunity. As long as they're under our roof, we have the opportunity to say, let me just engage, redirect, recalibrate, play a bit of that GPS voice, and say, we're you've got to take a different turn at this junction. And I believe absolutely that if we're honest with ourselves and sincere in what we're trying to do, then all we need to do is try. And Hashem will guide us if we're sincere and if we're trying. But if we don't try, we shouldn't expect that He's just going to miraculously sort it out for us. That's the responsibility of parenting. So have eyes wide open, finger on the pulse, engage with our kids, gently nudge them in the right direction. Hopefully we create for them a wholesome environment, and we will definitely, in that case, enjoy the benefits of it. Please God.